Long before he became a leader of nations, Joshua was simply a child born into hardship. The book of Exodus paints a grim picture of what life was like for the Hebrews under Egyptian rule: forced labor, brutal taskmasters, and no hope of relief in sight. Into that world, a boy from the tribe of Ephraim was born and given the name Hoshea. Only later would he be renamed Joshua, a name meaning "the Lord saves," a title that would prove prophetic given the role he'd eventually play in leading his people to freedom. As a boy, Joshua would have grown up surrounded by the groans of an enslaved nation, aware of the promises whispered about a coming deliverance. When Moses returned to confront Pharaoh and eventually led the Hebrews out of Egypt, Joshua was swept up in that massive departure, a crowd so large that Scripture describes roughly 600,000 men, not counting women and children. Picture a young Joshua in the middle of that multitude, watching miracle after miracle unfold before him. None of those miracles could have been as dramatic as the parting of the Red Sea. The waters split apart, forming walls on either side, while the people crossed on dry ground. For a young man witnessing this kind of display, it must have planted an unshakable seed that God could be trusted even in the most impossible circumstances. Apprentice to Moses. As the Israelites wandered through the wilderness, Joshua found himself increasingly close to Moses, learning directly under his mentorship. His name first appears explicitly in the narrative during the conflict with the Amalekites. Moses instructed him to handpick fighters and lead them into battle, while Moses himself stood on a hilltop, staff raised toward heaven. Even at this early stage, Joshua was already trusted with military command. That battle taught him something crucial. As long as Moses kept his hands lifted, Israel had the advantage. The moment his arms dropped, the enemy gained ground. Joshua fought on the front lines while Moses interceded from above, a living lesson that battlefield skill meant little without total reliance on God. His closeness to Moses only deepened from there. When Moses climbed the mountain to receive the law, Joshua accompanied him as his personal assistant. Being present for that encounter, the giving of the commandments, and the renewal of the covenant shaped Joshua's spiritual foundation in ways that would echo throughout his life. His devotion showed itself again after the incident with the golden calf. While Moses set up a tent outside the camp where he'd speak with God as a man speaks with his friend, it's noted that Joshua, still just a young aide, wouldn't leave that tent. He wanted to remain as close as possible to the presence of God, a hunger for the divine that set him apart. That same spiritual intensity surfaced when two men, Eldad and Medad, began prophesying unexpectedly in the camp. Joshua's instinct was to shut it down immediately, urging Moses to stop them, evidence of how seriously he took order and reverence for what he understood to be God's authority working through Moses. Chosen as a spy and refusing to waver. One of the defining moments of Joshua's early life came when Moses selected 12 men, one from each tribe, to scout the land of Canaan. Joshua represented the tribe of Ephraim, and it was around this time that Moses changed his name from Hoshea to Joshua, a symbolic gesture tied to the nation's hope of salvation. After 40 days exploring the land, the spies returned with a divided report. 10 of them described a land of giants and fortified cities, stoking fear throughout the camp. But Joshua, along with Caleb, refused to back down. They insisted the land was good and that God would deliver it, a land flowing with milk and honey. Their confidence nearly cost them their lives. The terrified crowd considered stoning them. But God intervened, and their unwavering trust was rewarded. Of that entire generation, only Joshua and Caleb were promised they'd actually live to enter the land they'd once scouted. The decades that followed, as Israel wandered the desert due to their unbelief, gave Joshua a front-row seat to Moses' leadership under pressure, how he handled rebellion, how he sought God amid crisis, how he stayed grounded when everything around him fell apart. Each of those years quietly prepared Joshua for the responsibility that was coming. The baton is passed. As Moses neared the end of his life, God directed him to formally commission Joshua as his successor. He was to be presented before the priest and the entire community, publicly set apart as Israel's next leader. Moses' charge to him was direct and unforgettable. Be strong, be courageous, because it would fall to Joshua to lead the people into the land and divide it among them as their inheritance. In the time that followed, Moses poured everything he could, into preparing his successor. Not just tactical advice, but the deeper spiritual instruction about following God's law faithfully. His final words to Joshua carried both urgency and comfort. God himself would go ahead of him, would never abandon him, and there was no reason to be afraid. Once Moses died and leadership formally shifted to Joshua, he wasted no time acting with authority, instructing the people to prepare provisions, because in 3 days they would cross the Jordan into the land God was giving them. And at the outset of his leadership, God spoke directly to him with a promise that would define his entire tenure. No one would be able to stand against him, for the same presence that had been with Moses would now rest on him. Crossing the Jordan. The crossing of the Jordan River echoed the earlier crossing of the Red Sea. God told Joshua that this would be the moment the nation began to recognize him as its rightful leader. The priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant were instructed to step into the river's edge, and the moment their feet touched the water, the flow upstream stopped entirely, piling up far in the distance, while the riverbed dried out for the whole nation to pass through, even though it was flood season. From that day forward, the people revered Joshua the way they once revered Moses. To commemorate the miracle, 12 men, one from each tribe, carried stones from the middle of the riverbed to build a memorial, meant to prompt future generations to ask what those stones meant and to hear the story retold. Before pressing further into the land, Joshua led the people through a season of spiritual renewal, circumcising the generation born in the wilderness who had never undergone the rite, then celebrating Passover for the first time on the soil of the Promised Land. A moment loaded with both historical weight and spiritual significance. The fall of Jericho. Just before the assault on Jericho began, Joshua had an unusual encounter. A figure appeared before him holding a drawn sword. When Joshua asked whether he was friend or foe, the answer was neither. He identified himself as the commander of the Lord's army. Joshua immediately fell to the ground in reverence, understanding that what lay ahead wasn't merely a military campaign, but a spiritual confrontation with God himself leading the charge. The battle plan God laid out was anything but conventional. March around the walled city once a day for 6 days, then 7 times on the 7th day, with priests blowing ram's horn trumpets. When the final trumpet blast sounded and the people shouted together, the walls gave way and the city fell. This victory introduced the practice of complete devotion of the spoils to God, sparing only Rahab and her household for hiding the spies. It set the tone for the campaigns to come, but the very next battle, against the much smaller town of Ai, ended in a stinging defeat. The cause, it turned out, was one man's secret disobedience. Achan had kept plunder from Jericho for himself in direct violation of the command. Once that sin was dealt with, Israel returned to Ai and won decisively, opening the path into southern Canaan. In the middle of these campaigns, Joshua paused to build an altar and publicly read the entirety of Moses' law to the people, a reminder that military success was never separated from covenant faithfulness. The day the sun stood still, the Southern campaign brought a series of swift, decisive victories, but one moment stands out above the rest. When a coalition of 5 Amorite kings attacked Gibeon, a city bound to Israel by treaty, Joshua marched through the night to defend them. In the middle of that battle, he made an extraordinary request. He asked God to make the sun stand still over Gibeon and the moon over the valley of Ajalon. Scripture notes there had never been a day like it, before or since, a day when God listened to the voice of a man. The extended daylight allowed Israel to finish routing its enemies completely. That victory opened the door to conquering a string of major cities across southern Canaan: Makkedah, Libnah, Lachish, Eglon, Hebron, and Debir among them. The northern campaign, with the south secured, Joshua turned north to face a coalition led by Jabin, king of Hazor, backed by an army so vast it's described as being like the sand on the seashore, complete with horses and chariots the Israelites had no equivalent for. God told Joshua not to be afraid, and instructed him to hamstring the enemy's horses and burn their chariots rather than absorb them, a command meant to keep Israel's dependence fixed on God rather than on captured technology. Joshua caught the coalition by surprise at the waters of Merom and won decisively, going on to systematically destroy the major northern strongholds. Hazor, described as the head of all those kingdoms, was burned to the ground entirely, a departure from his usual practice, underscoring the city's outsized influence and the symbolic weight of ending organized resistance in the north. The text summarizes the scope of what Joshua accomplished, taking the hill country, the Negev, the lowlands, the Arabah, and the mountains, along with all the kings who ruled there. It also notes, almost as an aside, that this war was waged a long time, a reminder that even miraculous victories didn't erase the years of grinding, patient effort behind full conquest. Throughout these campaigns, Joshua also had to navigate diplomacy. The Gibeonites famously deceived Israel into a peace treaty by pretending to be travelers from a distant land. Even after the deception was uncovered, Joshua honored the agreement, a decision that reveals how seriously he took the weight of a given word, even one obtained under false pretenses, dividing the land. With most of the fighting behind him, an aging Joshua faced a new kind of challenge: distributing the conquered territory fairly among the 12 tribes. God reminded him that though he was now old, there was still land left to allocate. Joshua organized a formal survey, sending representatives from each tribe to map the territory before dividing it into portions. Not every tribe received land the same way. Some, like Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh, had already settled east of the Jordan under an earlier arrangement with Moses. Caleb, Joshua's old companion from their spying days, stepped forward to claim the very land Moses had promised him decades earlier, and Joshua honored that promise without hesitation. Part of the distribution process included setting aside 6 cities of refuge, 3 on each side of the Jordan, where someone who caused an accidental death could flee for protection until they received a fair hearing. This system balanced justice with mercy, ensuring anyone in the nation was within reach of a safe haven. The Levites, meanwhile, received no single territory of their own. Instead, they were given 48 cities scattered across the tribal lands, ensuring their teaching and priestly presence touched every region. Disputes inevitably arose. When the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh complained their allotted land wasn't sufficient, Joshua's answer was practical: clear more forest, rather than wait for a bigger handout. Later, when the tribes east of the Jordan built an altar near the river, the rest of Israel feared it signaled rebellion or idol worship and prepared for war. Joshua sent a delegation to investigate first, and the conflict dissolved once it became clear the altar was only meant as a memorial, not a place of sacrifice. A final charge. As Joshua's life wound down, he gathered the nation one last time. His farewell address, recorded near the end of the book that bears his name, reviews everything God had done, from the exodus out of Egypt to the conquest of Canaan, and warns the people against drifting toward the gods of the nations still surrounding them. He urges them, above all, to love the Lord their God. The most memorable moment of that speech came at Shechem, a location already rich with history from Abraham's time. There, Joshua laid out an unmistakable choice: serve the true God, or serve the gods of their ancestors or of the peoples around them. Then came his own declaration, one of the most quoted lines in the entire Bible, that whatever the rest of the nation chose, he and his household would serve the Lord. The people responded by pledging their own loyalty to God, though Joshua pressed them further, warning them not to take the commitment lightly, given the weight of what they were promising. To seal the moment, he set up a large stone as a lasting witness to what the nation had agreed to. Joshua's legacy. The book closes with a simple, understated account of his death at the age of 110, buried in the hill country of Ephraim, land that had become his own inheritance. It's noted that Israel remained faithful to God throughout Joshua's lifetime and the lifetimes of the elders who outlived him, all of whom had personally witnessed what God had done for the nation. Joshua's life traces an arc from an enslaved child in Egypt to the man who led an entire nation into the land promised to their ancestors generations earlier. His example of unwavering faith, decisive courage, and complete reliance on God, rather than military might alone, left a mark on Israel that outlasted him by centuries, echoed later by the prophets whenever the nation needed reminding of what faithfulness once looked like. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe to further push these videos.